Welcome to Plato's Pods, Online Plato Dialogues. Today is February 28th. This episode is audio recording of the live meetup. We meet through Toronto Philosophy Meetup, Calgary Philosophy Meetup, Online Rebels. I am Eva Ellis, coordinating this live discussion podcast. And as you can hear, my cats are even so excited to join us today. And I'm excited to pass the screen to James Myers now. James?
Well, thank you, Eva, and thank you, everyone, for joining us this morning. And as always, very excited to talk about Plato and especially about the Meno, which I've said a number of times in the past was the first Plato dialogue that I read. It's a relatively short one, so maybe easier to approach from that perspective, but it's got so many interesting concepts in it. And, I think I've read it about a half a dozen times now. And every time I read it, I discover new things in it. And especially so after having spent our last two meetings talking about the Timaeus. And, I am seeing connections in the Meno to the Timaeus, and I hadn't seen these connections before. And I think it's very interesting. So very much looking forward to exploring that. As I was saying just before we officially launched this morning's session, I was feeling a little bit mathematical this morning. And so was led to put an image of pi behind me on my Zoom background, but it was really meant to, I think, draw on that image of the maze that I put in the meetup notice. And the maze was a reference to Daedalus, who was mentioned at the end of the Meno, and Plato talks about the statues of Daedalus. And Daedalus was the one who had the maze with the Minotaur in the middle of the maze. And so it struck me that the maze is really kind of an analogy or a metaphor for knowledge, which is really, I think, one of the main subjects of the Meno. What is knowledge? Knowledge has many paths, and we need to find our way through these paths. And that analogy, the maze, I thought was interesting. And then I kind of see pi as a mathematical, maybe, representation of a maze. Something that really never ends and just continues to keep going around with so many different paths to follow. So anyway, very excited to talk about the Meno and the nature of knowledge. I think it's something that's, perhaps very relevant to today's time, particularly as we, increase the power of our knowledge with our technology. And in that sense, I wanted to just announce I think the next meetup will do Plato's Charmides. Charmides, talks about science and talks about technology in a sense. And I think that would be a good point to pick up on from having done the Timaeus in our last two sessions, talking about the Meno today, about the nature of knowledge, and then to kind of explore the application of knowledge to science and to technology in the Charmides. And I think afterwards, after we do the Charmides in 2 weeks, we'll do Critias, which is kind of, I don't know, call it the sister dialogue to the Timaeus. It's the continuation of the Timaeus. And in Critias, Plato talks more about Atlantis, which was a technological civilization. So I think we'll do it in that order. So next we'll do Charmides and then the Critias. So to launch our dialogue today, and there's no real set order, and I actually have to apologize. I intended to upload some notes and questions to the shared drive that's linked to the meetup notice, but I just simply ran out of time. It's been a very hectic past 2 weeks, and so I just simply didn't have time to do that. So I think what I'll do today is really just kind of focus on asking a number of questions, and participants can, share your ideas on these questions. So, as with Plato, there's more questions than there are answers, which I think frustrates somewhat Plato, but others find that that's actually kind of refreshing, because I think together we can find some answers that maybe individually we didn't know ourselves. And actually, we see an example of this very early in Meno, when Meno says, oh, yes, it's easy. I can define the nature of virtue. And he gives an easy definition. It's in the first, 2 pages of the dialogue. And then we find out that Meno's definition is fraught with problems. So I wanted to start off maybe by just putting the question, what is virtue? And this kind of, plays on the question that is asked right in the first line of the Meno. Can virtue be taught? So if virtue can be taught, we would need to know what it is that we're teaching. That would seem to be logical, correct? And so I'm wondering, what is virtue? And in that word is, I'm thinking of what we learned in the Timaeus about the meaning of is. If you remember when we talked in the Timaeus, in particular about Stephanus reference 28a, in that logical flow that we reviewed last time, there was that distinction that Plato made between two types of existence. There is that existence which always is and never becomes, and that type was comprehended by a reasoned account, which we'll return to at the end of our discussion today on the Meno. So that which is and never becomes and is comprehended by a reasoned account. So that's one type of existence that we learned about at 28a in the Timaeus. And the other type is that which becomes but never is. And that's comprehended by the unreasoning sense perception. And so I wanted to put this first question today: what is virtue? But just let's think about that word is, if we could. And does it mean that virtue is always, for all time, one thing? And I just wondered what people thought, either with reference to specific words in the dialogue of the Meno or in your own perception of virtue. And maybe we could just talk about the four cardinal virtues, which Plato defined in the Republic, in Book 4 of the Republic, 426 to 435. So maybe, does anybody want to start us off on that foot? What is virtue? Is virtue anything? And we'll use the raise hands if you would, and I'll try to call, as always, I'll try to call on people in order. And again, give some preference to those who haven't spoken before. So we'll start with JK, and then Joel and Wayne and Jane. JK?
Yeah, maybe just to jump ahead a little bit. Can you say that the virtue is anything that is, or something that is good? And then you ask, what is good? Is that, would good be something that is, that always is, or can it also be something that changes? Or maybe it could be both, Mm. And so that's kind of for me, that's kind of a general way of trying to capture the idea of what virtue might be. Mm. Like, it could be inclusive of all the particulars, that you might use to try to define it.
I like that. It's a good point. So you're saying that it could be something that's good, and good always is and is becoming. So it really comprehends both states of existence, if I understand your point. I like that. And certainly, there is much discussion about the nature of good in the Meno and through Plato's other dialogues. So that's a good point. Let's explore that. And Joel.
Yes, please. I'm just looking it up very quickly on the Oxford Philosophy Dictionary, and it's just one sentence: is virtue is a trait of character that is to be admired, one rendering its possessor better, either morally or intellectually, or in the conduct of special affairs. So is virtue essentially just a characteristic trait to be admired or strived after?
Good point. That's one particular definition. Does it encompass all definitions of virtue? And so I would point people to what Meno says at 71e. So this is right near the beginning of the dialogue. Meno, when asked what is virtue, he says, "It is not hard to tell you, Socrates. First, if you want the virtue of a man, it is easy to say that a man's virtue consists of being able to manage public affairs, and in so doing to benefit his friends and harm his enemies, and to be careful that no harm comes to himself. If you want the virtue of a woman, however, which is somehow different, it is not difficult to describe. She must manage the home well, preserve its possessions, and be submissive to her husband." So that was a particular definition of virtue at a particular time, which we would now say is completely sexist. And Socrates actually does say it's sexist, and very quickly dismisses that. But so in that particular definition, there's differences of meaning. Wayne.
Well, I'll just give you my perception. I consider virtue as the intersection the of knowledge and wisdom, the rational intersection of knowledge and wisdom.
Mm-hmm.
It's that point which you find virtue.
Intersection of knowledge and wisdom. I like that. That's an interesting thought, Wayne. Thank you. Any other thoughts, Jane, Greg? Jane first.
Good morning, everyone. So this is how I understood the logic based on rereading the dialogue and on what we've read previously, specifically the Timaeus. I'd like to probably start out with drawing on that there's being, the eternal, which is what created the world that is becoming, so the changing. And as I understood it based on the Timaeus, the good, knowledge, virtue, wisdom, those are all things that are from the eternal, from the world of being, I guess it could be called. And the thing is that the human world, as I think that Plato and Socrates saw it, is the world of becoming, the changing. Excuse me. So technically, we can't ever grasp the being. And to us, it seems like someone just mentioned that the good can be changing. And as I understand what Socrates is trying to say is that when we think the good or like virtue or knowledge or wisdom, it's changing, it's actually not, because it always is, it is eternal. But since we are viewing it from our world that is always changing, it appears to us that it is changing. That is what makes us think that it is changing when actually it is something that is eternal. I think that's why closer to the end of the dialogue, Socrates came to the conclusion that, well, at least I saw it as Socrates trying to say that you can't actually grasp knowledge of virtue, but you can have like a good, right opinion of it. And I think this is sort of like a hint at that, a concept of like eternal versus always changing. That's all I wanted to add. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane, and for picking up on, I think it was JK's point at the beginning that, the good is maybe something that always is. But I guess, maybe the question is, how do we perceive good? Is my perception of good the same as your perception of good, or is anybody else's perception of good? And, in fact, I'm thinking of the...
Move.
I'm thinking of the point of logic in the Timaeus where it was described why the creator created the universe, and it said that the creator had no jealousy and was good, and so it was out of goodness that the universe was created. So that's an interesting point. I just wanted to raise.
Sorry, I'm sorry. Can I just jump in to comment a little bit, just really quickly? I think that, again, the reason that why we see it all, each person has a different conception of what is good and what is bad, and those conceptions can interfere with each other when people start communicating or when there's a situation of conflict. And as I understand it, that we all have slightly erroneous conceptions of things just because we don't have that understanding of good that is based on, the concept of being. I should probably think this out more, but yeah. So there's this general. Sorry, I'm having. Okay, yeah, I'm gonna have to think about it and formulate it better because sorry, I can't put it in words now. I'm really sorry.
No worries at all. I think you're touching on. I think maybe what you're touching on is that point in Timaeus 28a, where it says that to comprehend that which is, and if we think that the good always is and never becomes but always is, to comprehend that which always is, we need a reason to count. And so I think what you were trying to do, and what the rest of us try to do with the good, is to try to make a reason to count. If we think that the good is eternal, we need to make a reason to count, to kind of account for what is good. And is there anything that tells us what's good? No. I mean, Plato in 28a of the Timaeus says you need to make a reason to count. You won't you won't find it written in stone anywhere. So I think maybe that's an example of that. So no, thank you very much for that point. We'll go to Greg and then Asso. Greg?
Okay. Yeah, I'm sort of continuing on what Jen just commented. Jen made some very good comments, I think, in relation to what you early said as being and becoming. And my feeling is, like many of the concepts in those Platonic dialogues, that it's not that Plato or Socrates already know the answer, and particularly in the virtue, it's attempting to really to explore the possibility of answer. And I think there's two practical angle here. Like you said, one is to look for the eternality of a concept such as being, concept as a being that's eternal. Therefore, it is can be considered as a knowledge. And another thing is another angle is really to look at its practicality. As James and other people point out that there's all kinds of thinking, opinions about what a virtue is. So practically, it will be good to put a definition onto virtue, and so that everybody can agree on, even though everybody can have a different opinion, but nevertheless to agree on a common virtue, so that it's practically can be used. So one practical angle, one kind of theoretic angle. So I think in that sense that they are very much looking for kind of explore, the possibility of knowledge. And here, there's also this counter argument in the 72, and I think Meno was saying that there is a virtue for every action and for every age, for every task of ours and every one of ours. And in that sense that in a way the counter argument is very clearly stated out, in the sense that why are they, the difficulty of defining virtue, basically.
Mm. Well, thank you. And I think you make an interesting point, Greg, about the practicality of it. And, certainly at one point, Socrates, at the beginning of the dialogue, he asks, what is virtue? And Meno starts giving examples of different types of virtue. And then Socrates says at one point, well, if you do anything with a part of your virtue, if you take a particular action, say we say that courage is one of the virtues. It's, in the Republic, it's said to be one of the 4 virtues. So say if you take an action with courage, which is one of the virtues, does that mean that your action is virtuous itself, or you've just used one particular virtue in committing that action? And so maybe that's a question of the practicality of it. If you practice virtue, does that mean if you practice one type of virtue that your action is virtuous? Practically so, is that the case? It's an interesting question. So thank you for raising it. Asso, welcome.
Hi, thanks for bringing me in. So I'm just gonna give my response on virtue. And before we go on, I'd like to first ask the question, and I'm asking, why is it that we follow virtue and not vices, perhaps? Or why is it that we want to find truth and not falsehood? I call this the prejudices of philosophers, that even philosophers have to be at some point biased, because truly there is nothing here to compel us to truth but ourselves. And so I think that Socrates, when he's writing it, he's trying to appeal to virtues, trying to appeal to the philosopher's prejudice rather than the human's prejudice. And I'm going to make a distinction in that the philosopher's prejudice is that he must be biased towards reason, in which that he must value reason and enlightenment compared to the human prejudice, which is, being biased into emotion and to their own desires of the lower human being, which is compared to the higher human being, which Socrates probably wanted. So to be able to differentiate in his writings between the higher human being and the lower human being, I am going to assume that he made the writings obscure for this reason, so that only the higher human being was able to interpret these writings. And in that sense, virtue should be practiced as a sense of philosophical expression of such virtue. And it's in leading of the philosophical life can we truly understand the universe around us, while the lower man is going to see the universe as physical. The philosophical man might see it as expressions of ideas, just as how a mathematician might see that a square is a formula. A philosophical man might see it as a philosophical expression of an idea. Perhaps it's hedonism or it's nihilism, but it goes on. And I wanted to say that I think Socrates knew this, and before he wanted to privatize knowledge and to prevent any corruption of this knowledge and to prevent any lower man interpretations. So in that sense, we have to give this type of knowledge to the right people and to the right beings. Otherwise, we might face destruction in our very virtue and divinity of life. Yeah, that's my response. Thank you for listening.
Well, thank you for raising that, Asil. And it's certainly, it's an interesting question. This distinction between the philosophical human and the human who hasn't necessarily been touched by philosophy. And so we're all sort of naturally driven, perhaps, to do what we think is good for us individually, but then it becomes maybe a question of, is that always good for us individually? Like if I were to do something that is good for me but hurts you, is my hurting you going to have consequences that are negative to me in the future? And I think maybe there's an interesting connection to time in that, and when you talked about the bias of doing good and of doing virtue, it's maybe naturally a bias to do something that provides immediate good to oneself, but then we have to think about the consequences of time. And I'm seeing very much the consequences of time in this whole discussion about the nature of virtue, is that something needs to be, in fact, if you look at 89D, 89D, this Socrates makes the statement, we should not only think it right at the time, but also now and in the future. So he's talking about past, present, and future. We should not only think it right at the time in the past, but also now in the present and in the future. And I think that's an important point to keep in mind, and something that relates, I think, very much to what you just said. So thank you very much. We'll go to JK and then Joel and Greg. JK?
Yeah, it seems like if you define virtue in terms of pure reason, and you are consistent, with that reasoning, with your reasoning about virtue, then you come up against, maybe how would you apply it in real life, in the world of becoming, or in our existential world of change and becoming. So if it doesn't, if it's consistent with your reason, but it's not consistent with the world of the real world of becoming, then how could it be a complete definition of what virtue is? It's sort of like Goodell's theorem, right? Goodell's theory of if you have a complete system, it's not going to be consistent. Mm-hmm. If you have a consistent system, it's not going to be complete. So does that apply? I don't know. So it seems like the definition of virtue would be difficult to define rationally.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah. Well, the word rational, I think the ancient Greeks might have said commensurable, and then there are parts of the universe that are incommensurable, which is, we would say irrational mathematically now. And so, again, you've raised the question of practicality, and this idea of comprehending that which is with a reasoned account, and that maybe in the words that you use can be a rational account, a reasoned account. And again, that's what Plato says in Timaeus 28a. That's one of the states of existence. That which always is and never becomes has to be comprehended by a reasoned account. And here we see in, I think it's 98, in the Meno, 98a, I believe it is. 98a, where he says, "For true opinions, as long as they remain, are a fine thing, and all they do is good. But they are not willing to remain long, and they escape from a man's mind, so that they are not worth much until one ties them down by an account of the reasons why." I'll return to that particular phrase, which just continues to resonate with me. We'll return to it closer to the end, but I just wanted to raise that now. So we'll go to Joel and then Greg. Joel?
So for fun, I would like, I'm playing with the idea in my head of the very question of what is virtue, so to speak. And I want to challenge whether or not is there in fact a universal definition by which everyone can agree upon what it can consistently be? Because a lot of times I feel like the question in itself could be a loaded question, because if you ask anybody, you're going to get similar answers, but you're not going to consistently get the same thing over and over again. It's like asking someone what is virtue is similar to asking like what is intelligence. And you're going to, of course, say somebody who's very, very skilled in physics, you're saying that person is incredibly intelligent. But then, of course, you can ask the average person what is emotional intelligence, and they can pick up on social cues just by talking with somebody in sales, for example, or somebody who's good at dancing, but like is horrible at math. You're going to see an unlimited diversity of intelligence, and it's not just one thing. So is there like a universal, consistent definition of virtue? Oh, because I find it to be a constantly moving target, or a very slippery word that's hard to pin down exactly, you know?
No, I mean, very, very good question. If there were a universal definition, I would imagine that virtue is something that always is and never becomes, right? To go back again to Timaeus 28a, that would be that state of existence. If there was a universal definition, it would be fixed for all time, from past to present to future. There would be no change in the meaning of virtue. We would all agree on the same definition. And so, in fact, you used the word agree, and I just wanted to refer to Meno 79d. So in 79d, Socrates makes the proposition that shape is that which alone of existing things always follows color. All right, the proposition kind of comes out of nowhere. I mean, they were talking about shape, but he makes this proposition that shape, which alone of existing things, in other words, universally, shape always follows color. He makes that statement. He doesn't attempt to defend it. He makes the statement. And then he says, when I was answering you about shape, we rejected the kind of answer that tried to answer in terms still being the subject of inquiry and not yet agreed upon. And so you were asking, Joel, is there any agreed upon definition of virtue? I think when Meno tried to give a definition of virtue at 71e, he was very quickly and Meno thought that was a universal definition of virtue. Man must defend community, woman must be subject to husband. And very quickly, within a few paragraphs, Socrates had deflated that definition. So what Meno thought had been universal was in fact only a definition that may have applied at a particular point in time in a particular society. So it's a point that I think we need to explore. So thank you very much for raising that. I think it's a good way of raising it. Thank you. We'll go to Greg and then Wayne. Greg?
Yes, I just like to add on to, the question just raised by Asil earlier regarding the why. Why a society should aspire to virtue and choose such a thing instead of the opposite. And it's really a value question. I think think about this probably two levels. I'm thinking one is really the survival level. The philosophers are ordinary citizens, and their highest value at the time was the polis, the city. Everything is good for the city, therefore it's virtuous. So these character of virtues are really required for a good city, a good citizen. Therefore, in that way, it's defined. But that thing has changed over time, and nowadays, the characters of a virtue is if you could ask, is going to be quite different from the time of Plato's. And the second is more probably being philosopher. They are more kind of are looking for the essence and for the things that's called being, eternality. And I think in that case, they're probably thinking, virtue is something that can be beauty. So beauty, I think, is very high in the value chain of philosophers. So something virtuous is beautiful. Therefore, that's more eternal kind of value for them. So I think, and the thing that there comes to the question that, okay, is virtue as universal, as eternal, as beautiful as the thing called truth and knowledge? And I think they're looking for that. But nowadays we know that virtue really is more sort of a societal kind of character and not comparable to the concept of truth. Truth is still higher. Truth and beauty are equal in a sense. So I think it's interesting that they, I think Asil's question really has a lot of hidden implications there. Anyway, that's my comment.
Thank you. And I think your use of the word beauty is very relevant here and very important in terms of what Plato writes in this dialogue, but also other dialogues where he treats specifically the word beauty and our sense of beauty and this concept of beauty. And we'll maybe talk about, I know we'll talk about it in the context of other dialogues. I think that I'm getting this idea that beauty is something that is eternal, something that is not ever subject to destruction, something that is that is, there's a sense of unity in beauty, Greg, you've spoken about the fact that you're a scientist, and I think a lot of scientists are driven to inquire into knowledge, to derive new knowledge, to recollect knowledge, if I would use that term, or introduce that term in terms of the Meno, by a sense of beauty. We think that it's beauty we think that it's beautiful that things unify. We don't like disorder. We like order. And in fact, in Meno, Plato talks about order, and in Timaeus he talks about order, and order being more beautiful than disorder. So let's explore this idea of beauty, and thank you very much for raising that. We'll go to Wayne. Wayne?
Okay, I'm going to try to take this slow and not get tongue-tied. So back to my basic definition is that the rational intersection of knowledge and wisdom is where virtue is found. Within that intersection, a decision is made for the good, for it to be virtuous, or evil, which is non-virtuous. So within that decision, the preferred action that benefits the object would be the good action. And within that, the subject and the object, the subject should make that decision without regard to the subject. So good or bad, or good or evil, is not what the subject is going to experience, it's what the object is going to experience. So within that, once you've found an action or a decision that's good for the object, at that intersection of knowledge and wisdom, those should result in virtue. So I'll open that up to criticism, because I'm sure I missed something somewhere. So thank you.
Thank you, Wayne. I think that's, I was drawing a little diagram as you were talking there. I drew two lines intersecting at 90 degrees, and I labeled one of them knowledge, and I labeled the other one wisdom. And I put a dot in the middle called virtue. And there seems to be some logic in that. And I'm wondering, though, what's the difference between knowledge and wisdom? Is wisdom maybe something that directs knowledge?
Are you asking me?
Yeah, and maybe others as well. And so that would be one question. And I do like the suggestion of the difference between subject and object. And I'm thinking that maybe what you were talking about was outcomes, in terms of outcomes, objective outcomes. And so I thought that was good. So maybe, Wayne, if you could just
knowledge and wisdom.
Okay. Yeah, knowledge and wisdom. The difference between that.
There's light years between them. Knowledge is to me, are the truths, the thing that you determine to be, I guess, for lack of a better word, truths. That covers a wide category. But wisdom, you can have a lot of knowledge and have no wisdom. So wisdom is the ability to apply those truths and in a reasonable and rational fashion. So wisdom is the use of knowledge, whereas knowledge is just facts and truths and things, and you put them together, and you have to be able to put them together in some type of order or logical process, and that's the wisdom. That's something that when I retired a couple of years ago, I decided to study this in depth. And I found it to be very useful to me. I actually use this in everyday practice. But I can have lots of knowledge of things, but if I don't know how to use them, the facts and truths are worthless to me, or to anybody else for that matter. So that's my definition. But I would love to hear what other people say, because I could be totally wrong.
Well, Wayne, thank you very much. I mean, I think that's really, I'm getting kind of almost a computer science connection there. If I think of the topology of knowledge and wisdom, combined, in some sort of direction for an appropriate outcome for the object, knowledge to me is kind of like in the computer science concept, it would be like the data, and wisdom is what the programmer would apply to make the data do certain things, if I'm understanding kind of that analogy of what you were saying, the application of the knowledge. And so it's not just that we have data, but it's that we know what to do with the data, and this is why I think this dialogue is so relevant to the tremendous power that we are now developing with computing science. And this is why I mention this. I follow a lot of the developments in quantum computing in particular. Tremendous power. But the question is, can we use that with wisdom? And I think you've really touched on it, Wayne, that this idea of what do we do with knowledge? And so I think the Meno is so important to that, to understanding that. So let's see what others have to say about what Wayne just said, or any of the other topics that we've touched on so far. I do want to go into a little bit of the Timaeus connection in our next segment, but we still have time. So we'll go with JK and Greg and Joel. JK?
Yeah, I think what Wayne was just saying about knowledge and wisdom is interesting. So I don't know if this applies, referring to what Kierkegaard said, talking about, I think talking about his predecessor of building a castle and living in a shed or something like that. I mean, is it, one has a lot of knowledge about how to construct a gigantic, tremendous castle, but he lives in a shed next to it, and also referring to the idea of beauty and truth and order and so forth. The idea of the beauty as a kind of a unification of understanding or something, and that does not depend on disorder. Order. In order to have order, you have to bring a unity out of something that is disordered, right? So it seems like chaos is also important, in a universe, in a cosmos, that is complete, orderly. So maybe someone said that we don't live in a cosmos, we live in a chaosmos. So I don't know if there's any truth to that.
Well, thank you, JK. That was actually, when you talk about bringing disorder into order, it makes me think of Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, which I think Greg and some of the other scientists here would understand. This fact that we live in a universe that is physically uncertain. Two standard deviations orbiting around the same point, all focused on the Planck constant, which is the universal minimum. And so, and I think it's a good thing that we live in a universe that is uncertain, because it means it's not static, right? Who would want to live in a static universe where all of the outcomes are predictable? And so the fact that we don't live in a static universe, we live in a dynamic universe, means that we actually have agency in this universe. We can cause things to happen, and we can establish our own direction. If I were to use that analogy of programming, as I was responding to Wayne a minute or two ago, as the programmers, we are not constrained in the program that we apply. If the universe were static, we would be constrained, but we're not constrained. So what we have to operate with is knowledge and wisdom. Perhaps, if I'm to build on what Wayne was saying, maybe is wisdom, what helps us to bring order from disorder, or chaos, if you want to call disorder chaos, is wisdom, which helps that. And so let's explore that idea. So we have Greg, Joel, Wayne, and then Jose.
Yes, I'd like to expand what Wayne has his notion about wisdom and knowledge. I think, I'd agree that wisdom to me is the ability to apply knowledge to a particular situation. That's an important aspect of wisdom. But I would also think that, knowledge in relation to wisdom is wisdom take as a system. Knowledge is one element. You have when you apply wisdom, you include holistically that the entirety of what you know, what you value, but what is needed at the situation. So in a way that while knowledge is generally about something, was it true or not, and what it is, but wisdom is really matching that knowledge to the specific situation and come to kind of perspective, context, and the relevance, and then bring that to understanding. On the one hand, understanding that in the context of perspective of what that knowledge is and that situation is. So you're really matching the situation to knowledge, and then in the context of value and the perspective and the problem issue needs. So only with a consideration of that, you come to a proper or good decision. So that's why the wisdom to me often is connected to the maturity. That's why you don't see wisdom in kids. You see a lot of wisdom in older people because they have a lot of experience. So knowledge, experience combined with the situation, you come to better assessment, understanding, and application. Mm-hmm. So it really is a holistic perspective.
Interesting ideas, Greg, and certainly this idea of context, I think, is very important. And each of us is a unique being. Each of us has our own unique life's experiences, and so for each of us, the context of any particular situation is different. I mean, the context of my sitting here, speaking to everybody at this time, what's led me here, the account of the reasons why I'm here, is different from the account of the reasons why you're here. And I think it's in making this account of the reasons why we're all here. I mean, that to me is the context that we'll talk about sort of towards the end of this. I wanted to raise a point, though, because you talked about maturity. And there's a point that Plato makes at 89b in the Meno. He says, if the good were so by nature, in other words, if people were just simply born good, we would have people who knew which among the young were by nature good. We would take those whom they had pointed out and guard them in the Acropolis, sealing them up there much more carefully than gold, so that no one could corrupt them. And when they reach maturity, they would be useful to their cities. Isn't this an interesting statement, given what goes on in the Republic? It was a couple episodes ago that we talked about the Alcibiades, and points were being made that Plato was some sort of totalitarian because of the way in the Republic there's this creation of the guardian class, and children are taken away from their parents and sealed away and trained to be perfect because there's some perception that they're born perfect. But I think what you just explained, Greg, is this process of maturity is required, and I think Plato is very much on that line. And so, in when we get around to talking about the Republic, I think there's something that's maybe misunderstood there. I don't think Plato's necessarily advocating for that. I think this point that he makes at 89b in the Meno, I think is very important. So we've got Joel and Wayne and Jose and Jane. Joel?
Okay, yes. So this is a very fun question. The differences between intelligence and wisdom. So I want to give very quickly two or three.
We're not talking about intelligence and wisdom.
Oh, no, sorry?
I'm sorry. I wasn't muted. I apologize.
Okay. All right. So sorry, go ahead, Joel.
Yeah, okay. Well, just want to make sure I'm correct before I go off on this. Is that a fair question? Are we figuring out the differences between intelligence and wisdom?
Yeah, I think that's kind of where the discussion is heading. Certainly, I think it's fair to address.
Okay, well, I want to give two very quick examples. So when I was working out west in different fields in the trades, I remember my boss telling me that we were hiring a guy who went to some of the best schools in mechanical engineering and has a really high GPA, and has, he's just a brainiac, and he's going to basically take over the field, and everybody's going to have to step up their game. So when I was paired with this guy, when he was hired on, I realized very quickly that he was book smart, but he didn't even know how to put together a caulking gun. He knew the textbook definition of how what things were and how tools work, but when I told him or asked him to fix something, or something went wrong, or think on his feet, he was I was shocked. It was almost like he was starting from scratch, if you will. So another example is my girlfriend, who's a midwife. She, you obviously have to go through 3 or 4 years of intense academic procedures through university, but there's a huge difference between being book smart and thinking on your feet in an emergency situation, right? It's how do you apply that information? So you can be intelligent and know what definitions are and know it off by heart, but being able to use it and adapt and evolve through that and see a bigger picture, that's an entirely another skill altogether. So I want to say that's where wisdom could essentially come in. And then, of course, very quickly, my favorite part on The Big Bang Theory is when Sheldon's taking a road trip with all of his friends at nighttime, and the car breaks down on the side of the road, and Sheldon's well, there's something wrong with the car. Does anybody know anything about internal combustion? And everybody just laughs yeah, of course, we all have PhDs. We're masters about this kind of stuff, right? This is what we went to school for. We're rocket scientists. And then Sheldon's asks, well, does anybody know how to fix a car engine? No, not a clue, right? I don't know how that works. So I like to think that's a good distinction.
Interesting points, and it's maybe a good lead into the slave scene, or the scene with Meno's attendant, where Socrates makes the point that all knowledge is recollection. And the question is, we can be taught specific pieces of knowledge, but only if there's agreement on the nature of that knowledge. So maybe there's agreement on how to fix a car, and maybe that is something that can be taught. But for those things which can't be taught, maybe recollection is the important thing. And so maybe the first person to figure out how to fix a car, there was no textbook or manual for that. And so, maybe recollection at that point is really important. And so I think that's an interesting point to consider, certainly in terms of the practical applications that you talked about. We have Jose and then Jane. Welcome, Jose.
Hi, James. Hi, everybody.
Good. Thanks for being here.
I just wanted to share something that I read some time ago about definition of philosophy, and maybe it has something to do with what we're talking. He said that philosophy is basically three branches: epistemology, that is looking for the truth; ethics, that is looking for the good; and aesthetic that is looking for the beauty. And he said that the truth is good and is beautiful. What is beautiful is truth and is good. And what is good is truth and beauty. So there is a kind of an interest. It's a very nice thought that I wanted to share with you.
Well, thank you. The truth, ethics, and aesthetic. I like that. It really does seem to combine everything that maybe we all kind of seek in our lives. And so, an interesting point to raise. Thank you for that perspective and for that definition. Jane?
Okay, I'm probably going to be backtracking a little bit because we've kind of already discussed these things. But anyways, regarding wisdom, to me, wisdom is not only the ability to apply, but wisdom is when you are able to understand the implications or the consequences of the knowledge that you are applying. And an example that I could think of is in agriculture, when we started to implement different substances to improve crop growth or whatever, this in some of the cases applying the substances without having the right amount of knowledge, of true knowledge, brought to, for example, soil being ruined. And so we ended up doing in the long run harm to ourselves, even though we thought we were doing something good. And this was mentioned, I think, very early on in the dialogue, that why would we want to pursue virtue? And if judging by what Socrates said, as I understand that any person who is truly knowledgeable, in a sense, would never want to pursue vice, or would never want to ignore virtue, because virtue is what makes life good. So if you're not living a virtuous life, it's never going to be good. And unless you wish yourself evil, you would not pursue anything but virtue. This is what I understood from what Socrates was saying. So basically, a lot of the things that we're doing that are not virtuous are not because we wish evil or we don't want to pursue virtue, but just because we don't understand what virtue is. So basically, if we were able to answer the question right now in dialogue, we'd be able to live the perfect life, I guess. But anyway, I'm sort of trailing off. Another thing I wanted to touch upon is the concept of chaos and order, because some of the things that I've come across and thought about is that ultimate order is not a good thing. So I would imagine that ultimate order would lead to a sort of state of static, to a state of stagnation. And if we're talking about total order in terms of, for example, this would mean a sort of dictatorship. And from what I understand, that chaos, even though if it's total chaos, it has a negative element to it. But at the same time, chaos is what adds dynamic. It's what adds a sort of, I would even say, a sort of creative aspect to life. And then this sort of leads me to a question regarding what is beauty, because especially in the modern world, we're really, the concept of beauty is being expanded to things that, well, for example, I personally wouldn't consider beautiful, but they're being projected as something beautiful. And in a way, I think that in our world of becoming, the concept of beauty is based on a balance between order and chaos. At least that's one of the ways that I've thought about it in the past.
Wow. you really hit on so many themes there, Jane, and I think it really summarizes quite well what we've discussed to this point. And so let me say a few things about that, and then what I wanted to do next was, Eva, if you would get the triangle slide ready, I wanted to go to that because I think there's some interesting points that we can explore there that we'll talk about. But what you said, Jane, wisdom being the implications. I've seen that connection to what Wayne was saying in terms of understanding the outcomes. And I'm also seeing the connection to time because it's what we do with data right now in the present, we have to think about how it's going to play out over time. And, the example of doing something that affects the climate, we are now, COVID has caused us to think about the implications longer term of what we have done to the client. And young children like Greta Thunberg, have given us pause to say, hey, listen, 50 years down the road, I will be alive, you won't. What are you doing to the world what implications are you causing to the world of the future that I will have to live in that you're not, older people? And so I think that's a very important thing. And again, that connection to time in this dialogue, that wisdom is maybe something that helps to guide us through time. You talked about order and this, order leading to a static state, and very much I think connecting to what I said about Heisenberg's uncertainty principle and how that uncertainty is actually a good thing for us, but only if we use perhaps wisdom to approach uncertainty and use a sense of knowledge and understand the difference between truth and untruth in knowledge. And again, so much particularly as we have this tremendous computing power about to revolutionize life with the quantum computer. So I think that's so very important that we use that power with wisdom and understand the implications, because it will happen so quickly. You use the term perfect life, Jane. If any of us could be born to lead the perfect life, well, that would be kind of a static state, right? Then there'd be no room for creativity, would there? I don't know. And so maybe that's the beauty of life, is that there is this creativity. And a scientist like Albert Einstein, for example, came up first with special relativity in 1905 and then general relativity in 1915. But he didn't stop there. He didn't become a static scientist and stop seeking and learning. And throughout this dialogue, the Meno, Socrates says you must continue to seek and learn, and that, Socrates says, is recollection. You must continue to seek and learn. And so Einstein continued to seek and learn through the rest of his life. He never was comfortable with the idea of quantum mechanics being separate from the larger mechanics of general relativity. And he was seeking that beautiful, perhaps, connection. Maybe he saw this as some sort of beauty that drove him through the rest of his career to seek this. He never found it, but he was led to seek that. And so I think, again, that connection to seeking and learning, that Socrates keeps making the point that we never should stop to seek and to learn, because every time we do, we discover more. And so we have that chance to be creative and not static. And really the chance to set our own program through life. If we want to take it back to the computer science analogy, it's, we are the programmers. We are not programmed. We are the programmers. And so I think that's, as we enter this quantum era of the power of quantum computing, I think it's something very worth remembering. So I wanted to, Abby, if you put up the slide, I wanted to take us back to Timaeus in this, because this is very present in the Meno. This concept of same and different. In the discussion of virtues, Meno, in the Meno, keeps coming up with examples of virtues, and each of the examples is different. Virtue is being good, virtue is having power over others, virtue is beauty. He gives so many different examples of virtues. And Socrates says, we have found many virtues while looking for one, but we cannot find the one which covers all the others. That is at 74a. So Socrates says that. So we have found many virtues while looking for one, but we cannot find the one which covers all the others. And then in 72b, Socrates has just finished saying, Meno, you've given me a swarm of virtues. And he says, to play on the word swarm, why don't we talk about bees for that matter? So he starts talking about bees at 72b. He says, bees are the same in one respect, but differ in others. So again, this idea of same and different, which is very much in the Timaeus. Bees are the same in one respect, but differ in others. And he gives examples of how they differ. They differ in size, they differ in beauty. And then he says the same of the virtues. Even if the virtues are many and various, in other words, different, all of them have one and the same form, which makes them virtues. So one and the same, but different, right? And so I wanted to just recall, and we left off 2 weeks ago, our last episode in the Timaeus, talking about this idea that Socrates puts, that Timaeus puts forward, that the universe is composed of triangles, and then we looked at this diagram that I have on the screen at the end of our last episode, and we're talking about that section. There's a beautiful section in the Timaeus where Timaeus is talking about the Creator and the difficulty that the Creator had mixing the same and the different and bonding them together. And, as I keep thinking of that scene, I'm thinking of, when you go into a store and you order a can of paint and they mix the different colors together. And then they put the can in that shaker, and the shaker shakes and shakes and makes a lot of noise. And I had this kind of image of the Creator putting the same and the different in this big universal can and shaking the whole thing together, and the difficulty of making them stick together. So I think this is what Plato was trying to say in the Timaeus, this concept of the same and the different, but bonding them together. So we've got the virtues here in the Meno, that Meno is talking about all sorts of different types of virtues, but Socrates is saying, well, don't tell me about all the differences. Tell me about how they're all the same. Even though they're different, how are they the same? And so I wanted to return to this diagram that we looked at, because it talked about the triangles in Timaeus. And again, so for our listeners who don't see the screen in front of me, it's a simple triangle on the screen. It's a 45 degree, the angles at the edges are 45 degrees. It's a right angle triangle pointing to the right. There's a right angle triangle pointing to the left, and they're joined together. So the base of the triangle, I've labeled B. So it's a horizontal base. And then there's a vertical line A that bisects the base, so divides the base in two. So there's A on the vertical, B to the left horizontally, and B to the right horizontally on the base. And then there's the hypotenuse on the left and on the right, and those are labeled C. And we know from the Pythagorean theorem that a squared plus b squared equals c squared. And that's ancient knowledge. I mean, I think most where they teach that now in public school, I mean, most public school, I think hopefully pretty much everybody here has heard of the Pythagorean theorem, and, a squared plus b squared equals c squared. So I'll just go back to the question that I asked 2 weeks ago in our last session, and ask where you see in this diagram of the triangle with the vertical line labeled A dividing the base, labeled B on each side, and the hypotenuse labeled C. Where do you see same and different in this diagram? Does anybody want to take a stab at it? So this idea of mixing same and different, and you can just refer to them by letter. Is A same and B different? Is C same and B different? Or is it a combination of things? Any thoughts on that? I think we had some answers last time on this. Is A the same as B? Is C the same as A, or is C the same as B?
I don't think anything is same as each other.
Or is nothing the same? Thank you. We have all sorts of choices. But Pythagoras would say, what would Pythagoras say? I mean, Plato was, after all, a geometer, right? So Plato understood Pythagoras. right? Let no one who is bereft of geometry enter these doors was the sign above his academy. So in a right-angled triangle, A is the same as B, right? And A squared plus B squared equals C squared. So C would be different from A, different from B, right? So this idea of same and different. So if we think of C as different from A or from B, but A is the same as B, then if we were thinking of virtue, like if we have all these different virtues that Meno is talking about, if we were thinking of different virtues, well, if C is different, would we put the different virtues on the line labeled C, the hypotenuse of the right-angled triangle here? And where would we put all virtue? All virtue, regardless of the differences between them. Where would the nature of all virtue converge here? Joel?
This may be very off base, but I see virtue everywhere.
Right.
I think that asking for a specific spot for virtue may be misleading, and that the red dot, which could be infinitely divisible or placed anywhere on the perimeter of A, B, or C, could all be virtuous depending on what plane the triangle was being viewed in, what dimension.
You're seeing virtue everywhere.
Yeah.
But how about one virtue? So when Socrates says at 74a, we have found many virtues while looking for one, but we cannot find the one which covers all the others. So is there one which covers all the others here? Greg?
It's interesting you use the triangle to kind of make some analogical kind of comparison to virtue. And you ask that whether A, B, C are the same or different. I would say they are the same and they are different. I think the same thing goes to virtue. So I think Plato, was trying to having Socrates look for the sameness with a different kind of virtue. So within like A, B, C, we tend to look at them as different because they have a different lens. But if you look and say, well, they're all lines in that first line, okay, right away, they are the same. Because they are made of lines. They are lines. No, they're just of different length.
Right.
Yeah. And then also you can say, well, they are part of a triangle. Therefore, again, these lines are part, not just lines, but they are the lines of a triangle, further defined, just different lengths. So B and B may be different because they are the two lines of different triangle. Even though they have the same length, but nevertheless they are different. So in the sense that I think this triangle actually quite interesting in terms of symbolize the way that the difficulty to really look for sameness and difference in different type of virtue. And I would say that they may have some similarity in the sense that you may be able to get out some sameness from different virtues, but also look for differences between the different virtues.
Well, thank you. It's and certainly you make the point that the lines are going in different directions, so that makes them different. But in a right-angled triangle, A would equal B. So in this case, if we give a length of 1 to A, then B has to be 1 as well. And the Pythagorean theorem would tell us that C is what? C is the square root of 2, right? Now, the interesting thing about that, to go back to what we were saying earlier about what's rational and what's commensurable, is that with a length of 1, A would be commensurable with B, which also has a length of 1. But C is incommensurable. So C is mathematically irrational. The square root of 2 is irrational, and the proof of that is by reductio ad absurdum. So it's interesting here. Not only do we have things that are like A is like B, but different from C. We have rational and irrational, or mathematically commensurable and incommensurable, as the Greeks would have put it. So I wanted to recall this because we're going to go into a discussion of that slave scene where Plato actually places the squares with Meno's slave, but you can make a square out of this. How do you make a square out of this? If anybody wants to answer that one, I'd be happy to entertain that question. Jane?
I wanted to say that in the context of the Timaeus dialogue, I understood the same as being, so the same is basically a synonym for the eternal or for that which is being, and the other is a synonym for the changing, the becoming. And as I understand it, the changing, the becoming is what is sense, opinion, and belief. So something that is opposite of intelligence, truth, and reason, if we were going with that dichotomy. So when I think about it in those terms, it's really hard for me to comprehend this diagram of a triangle, to be honest. I can feel that there's a way of applying it, but I can't make it out for now. But to answer the question of how to turn it into a square, I think if we were to take the two triangles that make up this triangle and flip them over to fill up the left top corner and right top corner, that would make a square, right? I think.
Yeah, I think you've hit the nail on the head, Jane. Thank you. So you would just kind of reflect one triangle over the other, and you'd have a square.
Yes, you're just sort of like flipping it over, like like on the hypotenuse, you just flip it over.
Yeah.
And you get a square.
Exactly. So we'll see as we go into that scene where Socrates sort of asks questions of Meno's attendant. We'll see triangles, and we won't see them at the beginning, but we'll see them at the end. And that's, I think, helpful to demonstrate. I think there's a particular logic here that Plato is exploring, and the logic is based on triangles, and it's based on this idea, I think, also that this particular right angle triangle here is both rational and irrational. It's rational at A and B, and it's irrational at C, and I'm speaking mathematically there. So if you want to use the words of ancient Greece, it's commensurable and incommensurable both at the same time. Last time, we ended with the question, where do we see the soul in this? Because certainly in the Timaeus, at the beginning of it, Plato was talking about the formation of the universe and the embedding of the soul in the universe. And so I just wondered if anybody is seeing where the soul might be present in this particular diagram of the triangle. Jane? Jane, did you want to add to that?
Yes, I did. I'm so sorry. I forgot to unmute. Yeah. You just mentioned that A and B is rational. So based on how I understood the terms of the same and the other, since A and B are rational, I would say that they are the same. And if C is irrational, then it is the other. Since the rational and irrational are joined by essence to create a whole, I would assume that the essence, I don't know, the essence would be the joining points, and the whole would be the triangle as a figure, I guess. From what I understood previously, the soul is when we join the rational and irrational. So in this diagram, I guess the soul would be the triangle as a whole figure, I guess, if that makes any sense.
Well, I think you're certainly using what I would call a reasoned account. I think you've demonstrated, Jane, that by applying reason, that you've determined or at least put forth a proposition as to where the soul might be. JK, what are your thoughts?
Yeah. So you're saying that the geometry and mathematics can represent both being and becoming, the rational and the irrational, and so the eternal soul would be a inclusive of, or represents, the soul is that which is both rational and irrational. And these are perfect geometric forms that these and the perfect geometric forms of that Plato was referring to, are the eternal forms, and is represented by these geometric shapes in mathematics.
I think, certainly to bring it back to this question of the universe of uncertainty, which again, Heisenberg's uncertainty principle established, is that physics operates according to that principle of uncertainty. The one thing about geometry is it's certain. And so maybe there is some actual connection there in terms of where the soul might be, because we don't want the soul to be here today and gone tomorrow. I mean, we have to be pretty certain that the soul is capable of operating at all times. And so, maybe there is this connection between that the soul has to encompass, does it not? Both that which is rational and irrational, or commensurable and incommensurable. I put that as a question. I don't know the answer, but Greg, what are your thoughts?
It is interesting that to look at this triangle and then to think about rationality, irrational or rational. Put in the historical context, that the reason that C is considered irrational is there are some triangles that you just can, by solve the equation, you don't get a rational number, a whole number. And at the time of Pythagoras, it was horrible. How can this number exist? Therefore, they're considered as irrational. But as time passes by, we no longer consider C as irrational, because we consider it irrational, because there's a good reason mathematically and conceptually to explain why C is irrational. So it's a commensable. So in a sense that when at the Plato's time, it is still considered a irrational, and you can use this to kind of account for the soul, that is combination of rational, irrational, as symbolize the thing. But historically, I think it seems that we are going gradually from what is kind of uncommensurable to commensable, from irrational to rational. And it seems that the direction is one way. Something becomes rational, never becomes irrational. And then things what used to be considered as irrational now become rational. So I think there's a historical perspective on these things.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And actually, as you talked about irrational versus rational, and things moving towards rational, maybe that's an example of this kind of order that Plato talks about as we want to move from a state of disorder to order. And in fact, in the Timaeus, he says order is always better than disorder. And so is there any order in the irrational hypotenuse of this triangle, C, the square root of 2? Is there any particular order in the square root of 2? The square root of 2, if you put this as a continuing fraction, it goes on forever. 1 plus 1 over 2 plus 1 over 2 plus 1 over 2 continues on forever as a fraction. Is there any particular order in that? Can you say that something that goes on forever has a particular order?
Can I jump in here for a quick comment?
Please.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, the historical perspective that they started this tradition, but you look at the history of science, it really starting from a world of total disorder, very little understood, to today, we almost understand everything. So in a way that we sort of come to, the mental world of seeing the disorder of the reality gradually the reality become more and more ordered. Today, the world is almost ordered, even though there's still a lot of things that we do not understand. Mm-hmm. So I think this rationality, irrationality, and order and disorder, they're all connected. Mm-hmm. The world is ordered if you look at thinking in a extreme metaphysical sense, mm-hmm. And that's why that when Heraclitus, when he first conceived or this insight that logos, the world has logos, and essentially saying that the world has order, and from that point, that people start to, the Greek people start to looking for knowledge, truth, and and then come to the concept of science, and we things are using it to this point. So I think this movement from disorder to order is very much the I think the history of science.
Mm-hmm. No, and I think the point that you make is a very important one, and it relates again to time, that over time science moves from disorder to order. And I think that's maybe just demonstrates our kind of natural tendency to want to find order in these things. And so, over time, Pythagoras was the first one to display this or to demonstrate this relationship, this proportion. It's a proportion, and in Timaeus, one of the things that Plato says is that everything is proportion. So we have this particular proportion here: a squared plus b squared equals c squared, and that has informed some great things over time, including Einstein's theory of relativity, which wouldn't have been possible without this knowledge that Pythagoras gave to us, many thousands of years ago. And so maybe we'll just, Eva, if you would maybe just unshare the screen at the moment, we'll just return to a full screen and maybe just have a brief discussion, about this. Where knowledge is, and I don't want to forget that question though of where the soul is. I want to go back to that question. We're going to find the soul in that triangle image. We will find the soul. I would just ask maybe one question in that respect. What if you were to rotate the triangle? But at 80E in the Meno, Socrates remarks that Meno's argument is that a man cannot search for what he knows, since he knows it. There's no need to search for it, nor for what he does not know, for he does not know what to look for. And then at 81D, he says, as the whole of nature is akin. And I'd like to kind of understand what that particular phrase means. As the whole of nature is akin, and the soul has learned everything. Nothing prevents a man, after recalling one thing only, a process men call learning, discovering everything else for himself, if he is brave and does not tire of the search. For searching and learning are, as a whole, recollection. So, Greg, maybe what you just said about science and this process of, learning over time and applying one piece of learning to generate another piece of learning, which then goes forth and generates more and more learning. Is there any boundary or time limit or end to either the soul or to learning, or are neither of those things bound by any sort of limit? And certainly Plato talks about boundary at 75E. He talks about a boundary or a limit. So is either knowledge or the soul subject to a boundary or a limit, or do they go on forever? And I'm just wondering what people think about this. And I want to use this discussion, we have about a half an hour remaining, to get into that scene where Socrates brings Meno's attendant out and asks some questions. And in asking the questions, the attendant, who has no schooling, demonstrates knowledge. So maybe we'll just start, is there any boundary to what we can learn? And is there any boundary to the soul? And when Socrates says this particular statement, I want to throw it out there to the participants. Do you think, as Socrates says, that nothing prevents a man, after recalling one thing only, a process that men call learning, from discovering everything else for himself, if he is brave and does not tire of the search? What do you think of that? Do you think that's logical, correct? Anybody have any thoughts on that? Greg?
I'll give it a try. I think, again, come back, so many things that all these questions started from Plato and Socrates. I mean, these are very early time. They were really trying to differentiate what we call today is what the difference between intelligence and knowledge. Really, intelligence is really the innate ability to get to knowledge. And knowledge itself is really the result of the process of intelligent process. And I think at that time they are trying to figure out the nature of these things. And we now know better that knowledge is one thing, intelligence is another. And also this learning, and you could say that if you can come back, say a child is born, and without going to school, just leave it alone, he will come to certain knowledge about himself, just about pure intelligence that human has. So there is a recollection process, non-recollection process. There's an innate process of intelligence. If you will say intelligence is the kind of recollection of nature that to awaken your innate ability to learn, then there is a recollection. But as a result of the intelligent process, that's something you can either acquire by yourself, can be taught. So both are valid in some way. You can have recollection or awakening of your intelligence. That's by nature. But also that you can be taught by the outside information and by learning. That's also part of intelligence. So, but at that time, I don't think that you have that good understanding as we do now. But that's how I kind of think of it.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. And certainly, the use of intelligence, I think it and I'll put the question out there. I mean, the way I'm understanding it is the soul is what uses intelligence. I mean, the physical body benefits from intelligence, but the physical body, like my arm, has no understanding of the knowledge that it sees on the screen, right? I'm holding my arm out and I can see my arm on the screen. The arm is not, there's no effect. There's a lot of intelligence on the screen, a lot of intelligent people on the screen, but my arm has is not affected by the intelligence. What's affected by the intelligence, I think, is my soul. And I wonder what people think about that. Is knowledge something that's relevant only to the soul, and is knowledge what informs the soul? And I wanted to, I'll just maybe leave the question there and put it to JK. JK, your thoughts?
Yeah, this idea of recollection kind of reminds me of, this kind of maybe idea of the collective unconscious that we come into the world with a lot of the maybe instinctual knowledge that we inherit, from our ancestry, and that, but we still have to learn. And why do we spend, 20 odd years going to school, so forth, in order to just to dredge up all that knowledge that we've already inherited. Now it's also new things and so forth. But so it's a so how would you define the soul in that sense? Is the soul the kind of inherited knowledge that we have, that's this collective that's we share with everybody else, and maybe that's the potential knowledge that we come into the world with, but we still have to acquire so much more in order to stay in tune with the culture that we're born into, the world that we're born into. Yeah.
It's certainly, I mean, the thought that knowledge is something that transmits through time and accretes through time, it is something that's built on through time. It's something that we transmit between each other, but it's not something that's physically transmitted. I mean, we can use physical means to transmit knowledge. We can use cameras and screens and books and words to transmit knowledge, but really what we're transmitting is something that's not physical. And so I'll use maybe what's become a loaded word now, but I'll use the word metaphysical. And whenever I use the word metaphysical, I just simply mean something that's not physical. Something that's not physical. And metaphysical to me is the invisible universe that Plato talks about so many times. And we talked about in Timaeus, this distinction between the visible and the invisible. He talks about it in the Phaedo. so knowledge is part of the invisible universe, I think, maybe, whereas our bodies are part of the visible universe. But somehow the visible and the invisible need to connect. And certainly the soul is invisible. And so again, but there's this connection of the invisible to the visible. And so there has to be this means of transmission. And so you spoke, JK, about this idea of it transmitting over time and being taught to us, by our ancestors, by our parents, by our teachers, by leaders who we look up to. And I think that's a very important example of this kind of metaphysical transmission of information through the universe. Certainly it's a universe where information is conserved. The law of conservation of information is a universal principle. Stephen Hawking and Leonard Susskind had a very famous debate about that. And they both agreed that information is never destroyed. And so if knowledge is information, it's always present. It's a question of where is it present? And if it's used in the soul, where is the soul? I keep going back to that triangle diagram. Greg, your thoughts?
Okay, as we're talking, I'm kind of trying to, the thoughts come up as why that, Plato having Socrates to think that knowledge is a result of a recollection. And I think there's a logical necessity in that line of argument. Because Plato think, the forms are immortal and eternal. It's always there. Therefore, you cannot have its becoming, its being. And it's just like the soul itself. Therefore, there's no way that you can say it's learned, because learn meaning becoming. So it's a being, it's always there. So I think there's a logical necessity for him to carry this out. And I think this notion of recollection is just one way to think that could resolve this difficulty he has. But if you think that, at that time, you think put it forward to the time of Aristotle. Aristotle totally turned the whole thing around. He's saying that, there's no such eternal thing as this conceptual being, even though the concept is eternal in the sense that it connects to the nature in a fundamental way. But he has a notion that everything we learn is based on our experience, the perception. So everything is learned in this world. Nothing is coming innate. So Aristotle, in that way, he was able to formulate his entirety of the thing, how we know, basically, to come to that. So I think I found it very interesting, this transition of this, and also the beginning of why this question of recollection come along.
Thank you. And I will return to your words, logical necessity. I like those, and I have a particular connection I want to make. But first, we'll have Jane and then JK. Jane?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So getting back to the question of soul, I think this will match up a bit with what JK was saying. Intelligence, from what I understood in the Timaeus, intelligence is part of the same, it's part of the eternal, and our soul is the essence that joins the intelligence to body, which is the other. So that which is becoming, that which is changing, that which is finite. And so basically, as I understand it, that through our soul is how we are able to get any sort of good opinion or account of the reason why. But at the same time, this is the impression that I got from other dialogues, our body is actually what can act as a sort of inhibitor to us getting to that knowledge and intelligence, if that makes any sense. And about the invisible and visible, to me in the Timaeus, the invisible is, once again, it's the eternal, it's the being. So the invisible is the intelligence, and the visible is that which is becoming, it is the body. And our soul is the essence that helps them join together, if that makes any sense.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, it makes sense. Thank you. This idea of the binding of the eternal state of is that never becomes but always is, and the state of becoming which never is. Again, those distinctions that are made at Timaeus 28a. I think certainly there's that binding process that happens, and I think it seems logical, and maybe a logical necessity, if I could borrow Greg's words, that or JK's words, I think they were, that there be some sort of binding factor, and it would make sense that the soul be that binding factor. And certainly in terms of what you said about the body kind of being this constraint against us getting to this knowledge, I think that's a theme that we'll see in Phaedrus. I think it is where if I've got my dialogues right, where Plato has the soul driving two chariots. One is driven by a wild, untamed horse, and that leads in a bad direction, and the other is driven by a good horse. And somehow the soul has to corral these two horses together and make them drive in a consistent way that leads to some good outcomes. So interesting points. Thank you very much for those. JK, your thoughts?
Yeah, I guess we have a tendency to to imagine the soul as the kind of constant, consistent unity that doesn't change. And maybe it's if there is a soul, maybe it's not that that kind of unity that returns and lives forever. Maybe it's also the difference. The difference is more creative than the same. There is some sameness there, but it's not consistently the same. Just like you can't step into the same river twice because every time you step in, it's a different river. So maybe what is more consistent is the difference, and that has to be part of maybe the main part of what the soul is. If there is a soul that eternally returns and is repeated. Because that's how we want to think of the soul, as something that repeats and returns, and just like life, how we live life. And as we live life, our lives is not the same every moment. It's all constantly changing. Mm-hmm. And like someone said, if it was static, your life would be not very interesting, right? So it would be boring. So, but it's also not very realistic. To imagine a static life in a static universe.
Oh, very, very interesting. I like this idea of difference, and certainly, I'm not seeing in Plato a concept of the soul as being unchanging. I think it's something that deals with change and something that deals with difference. So I very much like the word that you used, and it again ties to that concept in Timaeus of mixing the different with the same. So somehow, if we're always in that beautiful analogy that you had of stepping in the river, and you're never touching the same molecules of water at the same time, the stage that we're on is continuously moving, and the soul needs to continuously place itself in the context, which was a word that was used earlier in our dialogue here. It always has to find the context. And it always has to find the unifying point, maybe that bonding point, like in that triangle, the point that joins the same and the different. So I think it's the soul is tasked, I think, with a lot of things, maybe you've just touched on the key task of the soul is to reconcile those differences and to continue to find the same. Thank you for that, Jane.
I just wanted to say that I agree with what was just said about the soul. And in the dialogues, I had the sense that Socrates sort of viewed the soul as being both the same and the other. So that's probably exactly what was just said. So it is at the same time has something that is eternal and something that is changing at the same time. And I find that the concept, at least the way that I understood it in the dialogue, of the soul has this sort of pre-dialectic concept to it, where you have one thing, then another thing that contradicts, and that contradiction helps to join the soul in unity.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and the way you put it, I think is it makes me think of this immense power of the soul. If the soul is connected to both the unchanging eternal world, the world that always is and never becomes, and the world that is always becoming and never is, and that's really the best of both worlds, isn't it? And that's kind of, it doesn't get much better than that. Like, can anyone imagine anything better than that? Being connected to both, both the physical, changing realm and the unchangeable eternal realm. So it's an interesting thought, and maybe this is the point. Just as we have about 15 minutes left, Eva, if you wouldn't mind sharing the screen, because I wanted to get to that, to the section where Socrates brings Meno's attendant to the forefront. And this again, we've touched on it a number of times throughout our dialogue, this idea of recollection and knowledge being recollection. So here, and this is in the Plato Complete Works, associate editor Doug Hutchinson, who we had on the show a number of weeks ago, was the associate editor of this book. And so this book, the version of Meno in this book, has this footnote in it. So this is where Socrates has brought Meno's unschooled assistant. So this assistant has had no teaching. Remember, the opening question of the Meno was, can virtue be taught? And so Socrates, as I said before, makes this assertion that nothing prevents a man, after recalling one thing only, from discovering everything else for himself. Right. So I think Socrates is maybe trying to demonstrate this in this scene, and this starts at 82b. And so Socrates says, in this little section that I've quoted, he says, so he's saying to Meno, pay attention then whether you think he is recollecting or learning from me. And he is referring to the attendant of Meno. So Meno says, I will pay attention. So Socrates says, now he's talking to the attendant. He says, tell me now, boy, you know that a square figure is like this. So he must have been drawing a square. The attendant says, I do. And so Socrates says, a square then is a figure in which all of these four sides are equal. So that's one little particular piece of logic about a square that Socrates makes explicit. And we all know that a square has all four sides are equal. It's just something that we all know, right? And the attendant says, yes, indeed. And Socrates says, and it also has these lines through the middle equal. And the attendant says, yes. So on the screen here is just a drawing of a square, and it's got lines through the middle. They're intersecting at 90 degrees in the middle, and so we can see the outer lines of the square are labeled 1 foot. So there's 2 1-foot lines on the top, 2 1-foot lines on the left, 2 1-foot lines on the bottom, 2 1-foot lines on the right. And in the middle, each of those lines bisecting the middle is each 1 foot. So there's 4 lines in the middle, 90 degrees. Each one of those lines is 1 foot. So you see the square has on its exterior 2 1-foot lines on each side, and in its interior, 4 1-foot lines. Now, the challenge in this particular part of the dialogue, and I think we won't have time to read it together, but the challenge is what happens when you start doubling and tripling and quadrupling this image. So at the end, I think Socrates is trying to see how much the attendant can remember. And again, Socrates says, I will not teach this person anything. I will not tell him the answers. I will let him get to it only by asking questions. So in this process of asking questions, Socrates is trying to demonstrate that knowledge is recollection. In other words, knowledge can be discovered on one's own, just building on things that you already know. So knowledge is like a continuous process. And I wanted to just go back on, and I'm sorry, I think it was J.K. who said that it was a logical necessity for recollection. And I wanted to just pause here and just say, for some context, or ask the question: is logic ever broken? Is knowledge ever broken? Does knowledge ever end? And it goes back to a question I asked earlier. is there any boundary or limit to knowledge or to the soul? So if we approach it from the perspective of knowledge has no end, then I think maybe that logical necessity that was expressed is, in terms of recollection, is something that becomes more obvious. You know, if knowledge is just continuously out there, you know, then our job is to discover it by recalling it. It's out there. We need to recall it, and we use logic, we use wisdom, we use virtue to discover that knowledge that's out there. And so, you know, the question that Socrates puts to the slave or to the attendant is, okay, so I've got a square here. It's got 2 feet on either side. What's the area of the square? So the area of a square of side length 2. Remember, each side in a square is equal. Socrates has given us that. So the area is 4. 2 times 2 is 4. And so he leads the attendant to this by just simply asking questions. He doesn't say to the attendant, the area is 2 times 2 equals 4. He asks the attendant first, how long is each line? The attendant says 2. And then he says, how many squares are there? And the attendant says 4. So there's an example of knowledge that is expressed that has not been taught. All that's been asked, all that's happened is that a question has been asked. Now, the question becomes more interesting in terms of proportion. So Socrates starts to say, well, what happens if you double it? Are you going to get 8, right? Because, you know, he says, what is 2 times 4? And the attendant says, well, it's 8. Well, then Socrates says, let's double the size of the square. So the question is, how do you double the size of the square? Do you just simply put another square next to it? Or do you have to add 3 more squares, right? Because if you just put one, so again, we're looking at a square here, you know, each side length is 2. So if we put another square next to it, we'll have a rectangle that's a total of 4 feet wide, but only 2 feet tall, right? So to double this, we actually need to add 3 more squares. We need to add 1 square next to this, and then we need to add 2 more squares either above or below, and then we'll have double the number of squares. But the area is actually quadruple, right? So you have a square with side lengths of 4 horizontal and 4 vertical, right? And an area 4 times 4 is 16. So we started with a square of area 4. 2 times 2 equals 4. But to double it, we wind up with an area of 16. So that relationship, that proportion, that's not a doubling, right? That's actually quadrupling. And so Socrates says, well, okay, isn't that strange? Because I was looking for a square that is double in area. So I started with a square of area 4, and I want a square of area 8. 8 would be double the area, right? But to double the number of squares, I actually had to add 3 more squares. And that gave me an area of 16. I didn't want 16. I wanted an area of 8. So the question is, how do you get double the area in the square? So in the interest of time, Eva, if we just flip to the next slide, or to the next page, this is Socrates' answer. So, except it's not Socrates' answer. He leads the slave to discover this by saying, what happens if you cut off half of the volume or half of the length by putting diagonals inside the square. So what we're looking at here on the screen is the same square that we started with. You know, each side length is now 4, but we've got a diamond inside the square. So we've added some diagonals. So Now this, inside the diamond, inside the square, we now have something with an area of 8. And so there was an interesting process here that Socrates followed. Again, he didn't give this diagram to the slave. In fact, this is in the footnotes to the printed text. So this is the editors of the text telling us what Socrates was leading the attendant to discover. But it was through Socrates' questioning, and in Socrates says, well, what happens if you put a diagonal in and you cut off half the space inside the square? And then it led to this realization. And then Socrates makes the point that, well, the attendant would have said originally, well, to get 8, you have to get somewhere between 4 and 16. So you'd have to go halfway in between, but halfway in between would lead to something that doesn't work. So, at this point, the attendant would have quit if Socrates had not kept on questioning and encouraging him to seek and to learn. And so it's in this process that the attendant was given incentive to continue to seek and to learn and to discover new knowledge. And so it was this discovery, how you double the area of a square of area 4 into a square of area 8. You create this diamond inside the original square. And those who know the Pythagorean theorem will know that those diagonals are the square root of 8. 2 squared plus 2 squared equals 8. So I just wanted to kind of give that as that demonstration of Socrates, kind of leading the attendant to that knowledge. And Eva, if you would just unshare the screen as we wind up, and we might just go a minute or two over on this, but I just wanted to make sure that process that Socrates was demonstrating with the attendant of Meno, who hadn't had schooling, this was the process that was being used, and the process to demonstrate that knowledge is recollection. It's something that somebody can discover on their own, and I think it's a very empowering idea, perhaps. But it's definitely something that was being demonstrated. And so I'm just wondering, in the few minutes that remain, if anybody has any thoughts on that or on the other themes of the dialogue that we've discussed. And it's been a great discussion today. Greg, your thoughts?
Yeah, it is interesting that they use this form of learning as a recollection as it's pre-existing before. But as the time goes by, we know that we can discover new things or learn new things either through self-learning or be taught. So which is other people told you, and or learning from the existing knowledge. So I felt that it is interesting that you should start from the notion of recollection to refer the first type of learning as just recollect, rather than self-discovery, which is the innate property of intelligence. Our intelligence, our way of reasoning of intelligence are fundamentally logical. Logical meaning in the sense that you're always trying to match to the reality. And over time, you become very logical because the reality is logical. Therefore, over time, you become logical.
Well, thank you. And the point over time, and unfortunately we won't have time to get to it today, but the point at the end of the dialogue that where Meno asks, what's the difference between true opinion and knowledge? And Socrates makes the point, well, true opinion is good. Both true opinion and knowledge can be correct. And so why is it better to have knowledge rather than true opinion? Well, he makes the point that knowledge or true opinion needs to be tied down before we can call it knowledge. It needs to be true through time. It needs to be true not just now, but it needs to be true tomorrow. It needs to be true next year. And that's this idea of tying knowledge down. So having just happening to luck into true opinion, you can be right, but you won't be right all the time. And so being right through all time, from past to present to future, is the key to knowledge. So that's an important point I just wanted to make sure that people understood. we'll have time just for Jose and JK, and then unfortunately it comes time to wrap up today's episode. So Jose and JK. Okay.
Yeah.
I was just going to point out that the process of learning, okay, as far I see is 2 steps. First of all, is you have to get to the state of aporia. It means like a state that you have to recognize that you don't know anything, and from there start learning. So you have to get rid of your false assumptions. And he uses that with the slave and with Meno as well. Meno. Okay, I was just going to point out.
Well, thank you, and that's actually a very important point to remind everybody about Socrates, and his famous saying, that he's the smartest man alive, for he knows one thing, which is he knows nothing. And I think if one starts from that perspective, then everything becomes knowable. But I think if you get stuck in this idea that you already know things or know everything, then you will not continue to seek and to learn, which is the one thing that Socrates in this dialogue says, that we always must continue to seek and to learn. There's no end to learning. There's no end to learning, and there's no end to the soul that learns. And so I think to me, that's a message that resonates from this dialogue. JK, take us to the wrap up.
That's an interesting paradox, because you're saying that you're saying 2 things at once that we already know, based on this idea of recollected knowledge, right? Recollection, and this kind of coming into this world with all this collective knowledge, but at the same time, we don't know unless we try go through the process of learning, and that these kind of knowledge that he also shows in some of the dialogues that you can also recollect some of this knowledge through dreams, as well as through the rational process of the dialectical process of reason. Mm-hmm. And there's so many different ways of learning, creative processes of art and so forth. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of interesting, idea, this the paradox of knowledge and learning and so forth. Yeah, it's been an interesting discussion. Thank you.
Absolutely. Well, thank you. And the idea of dreams, you will see a dream in. So I mentioned that we'd look at the Charmides next, and so there is a dream in the Charmides. If we recall our discussion on the Phaedo, there was a very kind of strange dream at the end of the Phaedo. So I think dreams definitely have a place in this, and certainly knowledge continuously needs to be tested. We can never be satisfied, like Meno was at the beginning of the dialogue. We can never be satisfied that we know something. Meno at the beginning says, "I know what virtue is," and then he gives a definition that is destroyed within a few paragraphs. And that's what happens. The more we think we know, the more we become complacent, and the less we test our limits. And so I think there's such a good message again, and it is so relevant to the power that we are developing today with our computing technology, that this is something that really needs to be understood and appreciated. And so I can never get enough of Plato's Meno and his other dialogues. And I think, in the course of our own dialogue here, I've actually learned so much from what people have said, the words that people have used, the connections that people have made. So I can't thank the participants enough for being here and participating in this dialogue. So it's been a great time. Thank you all for attending, and I'll pass it over to Eva to wind us up, and we look forward to meeting again in 2 weeks.
Thank you. This was Plato's Pod. It's always exciting to share, learn, and discuss together, friends. We know this would make Plato Eflatun proud too. Thank you for joining us. Thank you, James. See you at another episode.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, Eva.
Yeah, see you next time.